everyone. My name is Li Wan. My English name is Rachel. I'm a master student from Exeter. It's my great honor to sit here to present my idea. Honestly, I'm nervous because I'm new researcher in this era. I started to do the science and technology studies just because of my participation in the project that Anna mentioned yesterday. And then I decided my graduate dissertation topic and then start my research. So today what I'm talking about is a part from my dissertation. So my topic is towards understanding policy making as a calculation in context of the RRI. The presentation will be structured as a 4 parts. First part I'll talking about the RRI. And the second part I'll talking about my dissertation, my key question, and some brief introduction. And the third part is my analysis and my finding, the calculation thing. And the last part is my conclusion. Okay, let's start. My dissertation is trying to explore the policy making as a calculation. In order to build a clear picture of policy making process as a calculation process, I choose the policy in the nanotechnology industry in China as my case study to understanding the policy making as a calculation. But before my analysis, I think it is necessary to know what is the notion of the responsible research and innovation and why I choose this to help me to understand the policy making process. The issue of scientific responsibility and social control of the technology have been raised and assessed through a long time ago. The term responsible research and innovation has become an increasingly important phrase with a policy narrative. And the elements of the responsible innovation are also invisible in science and technology policy discussed, especially in emergency technology, such as nanotechnology. This is my case study. So what does the RRI mean? Actually, in reality, I think there is no unique definition and clarified in the RRI, both in concept and in practice. From the chapter 9 of the Innovation Responsible book, which is my literature of my dissertation and written by the ERA and ERIC this year, they said there is now a surge of interest in responsible innovation and its conjugate expression, responsible development, and responsible research and innovation. It seeks to extend scientific responsibility so as to include future societal impact of the technological development and is particularly visible for emerging high technology, like nanotechnology. Personally, I don't think these 3 terms is exactly the same thing. The broad definition of the responsible innovation is a collective commitment of the care from the future through responsible stewardship of the science and innovation in the present. And the definition of the responsible research and innovation is posed. Responsible research and innovation is a transparent, interactive process by which societal actors and inventors become mutually responsible to each other with a view to the acceptability, sustainability, and societal desirability of the innovation process and its marketable products. In my paper, I consider the aim of responsible research and innovation is to connect the practice of the research and innovation in the present to the future that it promises and helps bring out. So, let's move to part 2, brief introduction of my dissertation. Why I look at policy making and why I choose the perspective of RRI. So when we understand the policy and the policy making, there are a variety of approaches and perspectives. However, based on my research, most of the literature concerning and analysis the implication and the risk of the existing policies, or when they talking about the policy making, they look at the system, the structure, the characteristics of the policy making. They often throw light on the challenges and the potential of the RRI by analyzing the key policy and assessing the policy visibility and effectivity in the science and the technology fields. These works providing the useful insights into the academic policy making debate. But there is nothing I think it's not literature so much more about what exactly the policy making process. So we know policy display a largest process of governance, power, and social changes that shape the world. There are too many things that illustrate the policy is very important in the science and technology studies. So in fact, here I want to say, in fact, the policy and politic is argument issues. In some countries, they use the politic and the policy is the same notion. I want to define what I use the policy in my research here, what the policy refers to. In my dissertation, I choose the policy is the document that the governments or the organizations use its authority and resources to design and implement, which address the needs of specific sectors and industry with a different purpose. So it is obvious that policy plays a crucial role in the science technology studies. But the only thing much more important than policy itself has been the process of the policy making. I think even you talk about the policy making is how important, but the process of policy making have some problem or the policy is not effective. So I think the policy making process is need to be explored. That's why I'm looking at the policy express. So my paper aims to illustrate the realistic and comprehensive understanding of the policy making, including initiative, calculative agencies, calculation space, calculation methods, and their calculation effects with respect to the RRI. My dissertation have two central questions. Question 1, how do the policy organizations do a calculation as a calculative agencies? Question 2, what is the role of the calculation in context of the RRI? So let's move to part 3, policy making as a calculation. Understanding policy making process as calculation, it is necessary to know what is calculation, and it's also necessary to know what are the calculative agency. The calculation plays a crucial role in decision making. But the discussion about the calculation role as an important instrument to support decision making are mostly concentrated on the economic and the numerical era. I haven't found any material talk about the calculation in the policy making. So from the economic perspective, calculation, it is a pure and logical calculation. Also could the materiality of the calculation involve figures and expressions. In fact, the sociology also talks, in this perspective, also talk about the calculation. From the sociology calculation, the calculation can be called as a sociology of mathematics. When talk about this calculation in this perspective, all discussion about the computer system as mathematical entities. Specifically, it means the computer and also advanced digital calculator as a mathematical tool. And there is another perspective to talk about the calculation from the market perspective. Calculation is a complex collective practice which involves far more than capabilities granted to grants by epistemologists and certain economists. So, understanding the three perspectives of the calculation, what do the people talk? I want to say how to understand the calculation in the context of the policy making. This is also my key point of my research. Personally, what I think about the calculation in the policy making context is the calculation is a scientific, interactive, and communicative process which aims to contribute to the decision-making for policy organizations. It is not just a question of the consequence of the specific calculation, but frequently of complex situation and flexible methodologies. Like the Li Vang 1980 said, when we talk about the calculation, it doesn't mean we talk about the mathematical or even the numerical operation. So, after clarifying the specific meaning of the calculation with a different perspective, we also need to have a clear idea of what the calculation agency are. It is obviously the calculation is done or will be done by the calculative agencies. But what are the calculation agencies for policy making? In fact, the entities responsible for the calculation refers to the calculative agency. But this sentence doesn't make sense. If you know this sentence, everybody knows, in the nanotechnology industry, what organizations or what entities can be seen as a calculation agency. So, how to understand a calculation agency is directly determine whether I can identify the who do the calculation or who has capability to do the calculation. So, for policy making, does a policy organization can be seen as a calculative agency? Because when we talk about policy making, it's easy to think, policy organization is such as some authority or some academic or something, they do a calculation. But can we really say they can be seen as the calculative agencies? So, my case study is policy making nanotechnology in China. So from here, I will combine my case study to explore my idea about how can I understand the policy making as a calculation. So based on the calendar 1998, they said there are at least three things. There are three things that the calculative agency need to do so that they can make a decision. So, these three things, I don't need to repeat again. In other words, if the calculation agency, they are able to do these three things, so they can make a decision. Yes, please pay attention to it. They said that they can make a dissertation. Don't say they can be seen as calculative agencies. So even the policy organizations, they exactly do the same thing, or exactly some of the three steps about what they have to do or what they have done. But it can't say they can be seen as a calculative agency just based on these three steps. But in my paper, I treated the policy organization as a calculative agency, but I don't, according to these steps. With my support theory is the modern notion of calculation agencies. This is also from the Callan, from the 2005. These three steps is beyond the older three steps, and in this paper, the Callan identified the definition of the calculation agency. If the calculative agency has do the three steps or do the three same things, they can be treated as a calculative agency. So from this point of view, speaking of the policy organization as a calculative agency is not particularly innovative. So the policy organization concerned as a calculative agency proposed by my paper led us to the formulation of the question, yes, you said the policy organizations can be seen as the calculative agencies. Yes, I agree. But who take initiative for calculation? What is the calculative space? How do they calculate it? What's the calculative method when they design or when they want to make a big policy? So, I will talk first, who will take initiative for the calculation? In China, when we look at the key industry policies in nanotechnology, there are 5 main calculation agencies for making policies in nanotechnology industry, such as MLST, KS, the slides have said. For the other policy organizations, such as technological parks, research centers, or scientific academy, who take initiative, it depends on the specific situation. Because what I look at is the key policies in the nanotechnology industry. So here what I talk is the calculating agency is about the national, this kind of the organizations. So my next question is, what's the space of the calculation? Or we can say, what is the scope of the calculation? According to the canon, is that there is a definition, a new entity must must be produced that corresponds precisely to the multiplication effect in the calculative space and consequently links the entities taken into account. And there's another definition. The later 1987 defined a finite number of entities are moved around and ordered in a single space. Here, the single space has been considered in a broad view. It is not just the entity itself, but also, by extension, the surface on which the entities to calculate are moved. So, what's the calculation space? Where and which aspects should be calculated? In my research, I identified the calculation space included two big parts: numeric data and non-numeric data. How to understand? The numeric data, such as the market share, investment, or the rate, or some of the, just the data, and the non-numeric data, which is included the value, implication, and the RRI, or some of the intangible things. So according to the Cannon and the Manus 2005 that key paper, they said the calculation is based on the perspective of the achievement of each calculated step. They said calculation can either meet the requirement of algorithmic and formulation or be closer to intuition or judgment. The definition creates a continuum between the quantitative calculation and qualitative judgment. And it is what Frank calls the quant calculation. This perspective can be seen as a calculation based on the numeric data such as market share, investment, input, output, and so on. It is fine. I can't say I totally disagree this view, but based on my research, my interview, and my work, I want to say I just partly agree with this point. What I want to emphasize here is rethink the quantitative calculation. The quantitative calculation in the natural science and in the social and humanistic fields often relies on the numbers. But however, the quantitative calculation or quantification doesn't only refer to the numbers and the numbers things. So it is also included new non-numerical data such as RRI, implication, the values or the public value, and so on. That is what I understand the calculation in policy making. It is obvious that both calculation and quantification methods are not no more fixed. In other words, the methods are flexible, and this viewpoint throws light on the analysis of the methods of calculation of policy making, which is not limited to the calculator. They give me inspiration and civic support to analyze the methods of calculation in nanotechnology industry policies and the potential methods which could be used. So based on the I will say the calculative methods. Based on the economic calculation perspective, the form of the calculation is doing the market research to get the actual data such as market share, product value, increase rate or something. But doing this kind of calculation is a very material thing. As in the case of the mechanical calculator or computer, what I want to emphasize is a new method of the calculation rather than numerical calculation. Here, just I emphasize on this part on the non-numerical calculation, but I didn't say they don't include the numerical calculation. So the calculation method, what I identify is from a case study from the nanotechnology industry. The first method is distributed actions. Based on a case study and interview, distributed actions means in order to capture the goal, no matter the national goal, the regional goal, the whatever, the policy-making organizations convene of tools, create rules and routines to set up organization or programs to calculate for them. In fact, this is the main way in China, especially in the nanotechnology industry, when they calculate as a calculative agency. Actually, calculative agency are not a human individual, but collective hybrids. It's the center of the calculation. The agency are equipped with the instrument, and calculation doesn't happen only in human minds, but are distributed among the humans and non-humans. I look at the most of the key policy deeply in the nanotechnology industry. I just give a simple example to illustrate why I say the distributed actions. For instance, in the 10th five-year plan, 2001 to 2005, the purpose was to reduce the gap between the nanotechnology research and market demand. The question is, how does the policy maker know market demand? How do they distinguish the gap between them and so forth? And how to design the visible policy to achieve the goal? And what do the expectation come from? It is not just easy to get the information just from the data. Yes, last year we invested how much, account for the 15% of the GDP or something in our country, or just depends this kind of data. Maybe it's not so easy to make a decision to come out a new big policy. So the policy organizations, they created the routines to help themselves to calculate and set up organization and programs. That is, for this 10th five-year plan, they have set up divided to the 3 small programs. It's a short program, middle program, and the long-term projects. And the second methodology is conference and forums. Open the international or regional conference and forums are also the calculation methods for the policy making. They will also the useful data, the benchmark, or the information to the policy makers, give them a new useful information. And I use the example of the 12, the 5th plan in nanotechnology, which give the useful idea about how to consider the RRI in the policy making. And the third method, I will say the international cooperation. For the policy making organizations, such as the key research centers, I take the Shanghai Jiao Tong University Nanotechnology Research Center, which was founded from the National Nature Science Foundation and ranked first in China. Why they rank first in China? Because they always strain its independent scientific research innovation capability and the good policy. When I see the interview, they said what they do in policy, when they make the policy, they depend on the cooperation and the exchange and share the information, and from the international cooperation, this is a very good platform to offer them the good thoughts about the policy making. Okay, and the last 1 minute, I want to make my conclusion. My conclusion is the calculation in policy is often not a question of the consequence of individual technologies, products, or plans, but frequently of the complex conflict situation. In the technologies, innovation potentials, patterns of the production and the consumption, lifestyle, culture, anything, it's just identify is a complex situation and methodologies, and which give the much more wider scope of the issues such as responsible research and innovation, ethic issues, technology assessment. When they making a policy, they will give the idea to consider this kind of thing. It will give the critical awareness of the ways in which the calculation involved when the policy maker designed the policy. So, and the conclusion also should consider as the indigenous the context. Finally, my research also has a significant impact for the future development of policy. They release the questions such as, to what extent the construction of technological development, especially future development, depends on the effectiveness of calculation when they make the policy? And where is the best place to engage the responsibility in policy making? And the future development in terms of the expectations, scenarios, and visions will be better explored and analysis in the process of policy making with the calculative approaches. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, I don't need two. You thought I know. Is it on? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Actually, when you were beginning to speak, I had one question in mind, but now in a sense I'm going to have to ask a broader question, because at first I was concerned about how the future is represented in responsible innovation. Okay? But actually, in a way I have a much bigger question, is in what sense is China's nanotechnology strategy an example of responsible innovation? No, because you never really talked about that, right? You gave a presentation that begins by telling us kind of what responsible innovation is, and you said that it was this idea of using the present as a basis for care for the future. And so I was going to ask, how is that represented? And I thought there would be some discussion when you talked about calculation, about how the future is represented in the calculation. But the closest you got to that was when you finally talked about China, and then you talked about market demand, right? And that is certainly one way of talking about the future, a fairly narrow economic way that actually doesn't require talking about the future in some ontological big sense. That's just a normal way in which one does kind of market reasoning, right? The future in that sense is always represented in market reasoning in terms of market demand. And so, and responsible innovation, I take it, is something more than that. That it has a kind of different sense of the future that is somehow going to be represented in the calculation. And so the question to you is, how? And before that, in what sense is China an example of responsible innovation?
Thank you for your question. Actually, I take the responsible renovation, RRI, as a perspective to understand the policy making as a calculation. In simple words, when the policy making, they design the policy, they should consider the RRI, but not I talk about the China as the example of the RRI. But in the nanotechnology, RRI is very important in this emergency technology. So the policy in the nanotechnology plays a very crucial role. So when they design the policy in the nanotechnology, from this perspective, it is easy to understand the policy making as a calculation process. And I don't emphasis on the China as the future development of the country, this example.
Just one, the notion of calculation, it seems to me, is one that's already there in policy making. That in a sense you don't need to talk about responsible innovation at all. At least you haven't given a good reason for talking about responsible innovation, other than the fact that it's true. In nanotechnology there's a lot of discussion of this. But what's important is to get a sense of how this is represented in the calculation, right? And that's what I thought you were going to get to at some point. But the only time you talked about the representation of the future in calculation was in ordinary market terms.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you made some interesting points, but as Steve was suggesting already, they're not really completely integrated yet. And that's understandable, I suppose, if you start with such a difficult topic. And I would like to introduce two considerations which have to be taken into account, which might modify what you try to do at the moment, and they have to do with this calculation stuff. And it might well be that this whole notion of policy making as calculation is easy to apply in China, but not so easy to apply in other countries, and perhaps if you look more closely in some places. And so you might have to reconsider whether you want to actually look at a particular type of policy making, as the Chinese type of policy making, or whether you want to look at policy making, and then you might have to reconsider the notion of calculation. And so one thing is where you can start with where very sort of typical calculations occur, we've been looking at one area of nanotechnology called plastic electronics or organic large area electronics. And there, the European Union is involved, some countries like Germany, but lots of firms and lots of marketing consultants. And the marketing consultants come up with these market prospects. And one of the things that's happening is that the various marketing companies, consultancies have different market projections, and there's a whole battle between these consultancies and some people who might use these calculations about what is the right kind of market perspective. And there is a sort of internal battle as well, that what is the strategy of a consultant? Should it go with the hype, or should it actually think about possible disappointments already, the thing that I was talking about? And so it's quite a complex situation, and in your terminology, or the terminology you're quoting from Bruno Latour, you could say, in this area there is no center of calculation, but policy is being made. It's somehow in these negotiations. So it doesn't do away with your starting point of calculation, but it makes it impossible to do it in a simple way, because there is no identifiable center, although there are outcomes. The other thing which makes the situation a bit more complex, for and I give the example for nanotechnology, but it might be more general, is the situation in the Netherlands, where the Dutch government refused to make any policy about nanotechnology, in spite of the fact that the nanotechnology community and industrialists, but also the parliament, was asking for it for about 4 or 5 years. And the government said, no, what we're going to do is we delegate this to the nanotechnology community and some industries, and they can get funding from us, not for nanotechnology, but in a competition for big R&D projects. And that's what happened. So they were delegating the actual responsibility, including some of the calculations, to other bodies. And I think that's an important consideration also for when you start to use responsible research and innovation as it being discussed now and applied to some extent in the European Union, because if you look at the phrases and also look at the practices, what's actually happening is that the reference to responsible research and innovation is a way for governments to delegate decisions to bodies and actors at a lower level, because it says you have to be responsible. It says that to industry. You have to think about the future, and you have to take that into account in your decisions, and then things will be better. So they delegate what is often thought of as the responsibility of government to make decisions in a collective interest. They now, with this phrase of responsible innovation, they delegate it to actors lower down. And I think that can be accommodated perhaps in your perspective, but then you have to think that through before you can actually apply it.
Okay, thank you very much.
This is advice perhaps rather than comment. Okay.
I have a small question. Are you going to consider particular genre of policy-making calculations like cost effectiveness, regressions, or it's not a part of your research? Because I think it's super interesting when you take, say, simple or not very simple cost effectiveness analysis and then think of it in terms of responsibility. Does it make any sense in terms of responsible policy making? Not only distributing sort of agency involvement, but just inside of the calculation. Does it make any sense of being responsible if you and cost effectiveness method is very, very interesting when they play with figures and ratios and justify why this is better and more effective and why this is not. So in your work, are you going to work with this genre of calculations? No?
Okay, thank you.
And we have time for one very last question. This is Ivan.
I like this very STS in its core approach. A very interesting element. The speaker before me, they already realized what I wanted to say, but my point is close to the last two comments, is that if you really want to have some added value of responsible innovation, you have clearly to point when designing your calculation tools and methods. You said it is numerical and non-numerical, but somehow have to be identified what this responsible innovation adds to additionally to, like Steve said, this market projection or consultancy company. This is one thing. And then I have a little bit comment on what Ari said, that of course the government, they can delegate responsibility to the lower level actors, but so that they, for example, apply to the funding in the general scale with other project. But if the government want to, or the center of calculation, today the point is that still we can say that there is kind of center of calculation. If they add in the criteria of project selection some item of responsible innovation, I mean, we're evaluating nano project against biotech or space research, and we decided where to put more money, then in the selection criteria, you should be put this kind of social responsibility and all that's related with the responsible innovation as a content, so that we can judge if this is not quite respond to the new understanding of responsible innovation, then you should not fund this project also. So still, the fact that we delegate to the lower level actor responsibility doesn't mean completely that we take off the idea of center of calculation. It's kind of more complex game.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for the most exciting session. Now a well-deserved lunch awaits us in the same place as yesterday.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you all.